Hello everyone and welcome to this next lecture in the NPTEL course Machine Learning for Core Engineering Disciplines. In the last lectures and tutorials we have covered various machine learning models, and these include models including decision trees and also their backed and boosted counterparts, support vector machines, Gaussian process regression and so on. It is now time for us to cross the final frontier in machine learning, which is about deep learning and neural networks. So let us go ahead and delve into the field of deep learning. The topic for today is deep learning and neural networks. Okay. So, what is deep learning and what are neural networks? That is the question we want to answer. So, deep learning is the branch of machine learning ML that involves the use of models known as neural networks these are abbreviated as NNs, which allow for nonlinear regression as well as multi-class classification. Okay, so you can use it for both regression as well as multi-class classification, and neural networks can have non-linearities built into it. So, you can explain any kind of data, linear data of course, for which you do not really need neural networks, and a lot of complex multivariate non-linear data where deep learning and neural networks play a very important role. So, why are these called neural networks? So, it is a form of a network, right, where there are a lot of nodes and these nodes are interconnected, and by passing values or information through these nodes we are led to a final prediction. So, that explains the name neural network. So, let us write that down. So, neural networks NNs are typically supervised ML models right, although one can use them for unsupervised and generative models as well. Okay, which consist of multiple nodes arranged into several layers. Okay, leading to a final prediction. Okay, so, you have several nodes and these lead you to a final prediction that you are interested in. So, depending on the engineering discipline that you belong to, you may want to predict various target variables, they could be continuous, they could be discrete and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, what are these layers we are talking about, right? So, we have given names to these layers depending on where in the neural network they exist. Okay. So, these layers they can include an input layer, where feature values are received into the network. So, that is called the input layer. Then there are a bunch of hidden layers. So, hidden layers where information, or you can say data, undergoes several linear and non-linear operations, and finally an output layer where the target variables, so target variable or variables are predicted, right. So, if you have one target variable, usually in a regression problem you have one target variable, then you have then you are predicting only one value. So, you have one node in the output layer, but in multi-class classification wherein you are trying to predict the values of probabilities of various classes, you are predicting multiple variable values, and therefore, the output layer can have more than one node. So, I hope you understand that in a neural network the nodes are arranged into several layers, which could include an input layer, a hidden layer or several hidden layers, as well as an output layer. Okay. So, the nodes, right. So, the nodes transmit data over the network combining via weights and biases So, if you already remember, weights are basically scalars that multiply your variable values. So, they are scaling your variables, and biases are the intercept terms, right, the additional terms that are getting added to set the scale of the problem. So, you have both weights and biases, right, which are used to act on the data that you have, and the data is also acted upon by nonlinear activation functions. Combining via weights and biases and being acted upon by nonlinear activation functions. Right, before generating the desired output, right, in the output layer. So, this is all a theoretical description of what happens. So, let us just see how a neural network could look like, and we will do that with the help of an illustration, and let us take a simple example here. So, we will have an example of a neural network in which you will have, we will consider 4 features, right, and these will appear in the input layer. Then we will have one hidden layer with 5 nodes, and finally we will have one target variable, and that will be in the output layer. That will be in the output layer. Now, in this example we will have only one hidden layer, but obviously to exploit all the nonlinearities and capture the complex dependencies within the data set, you may have to have multiple layers, right, in most cases. So let us draw a network which has all these characteristics. So in the input layer, let us consider 4 different features: x1, x2, x3 and x4, and these are getting combined, right, through weights and biases to form the nodes in the hidden layer, and we will name them here as z1 2, z2 2, right. So the superscript indicates the layer number. So this is the second layer of the neural networks, then z3 2, then z4 2 and z5 2. Remember, we said that there is one hidden layer with 5 nodes. So that is why I have drawn 5 nodes here, and these nodes go from z1 2, z2 2, z3 2, z4 2 to z5 2, and also to recall, the superscript indicates the layer number. So this is layer number 2, right. So we have 3 layers. This is layer 1, which is the input layer, then this is layer 2, and then we also have the output layer, wherein, as I said, we have only one target variable. So let us draw that out as well. So the target variable is just y, and you can write down that this is basically the output layer, right, which is layer 3 here, and this is the hidden layer, and finally this was the input layer. Okay. So let us now draw the interconnection between the nodes. Remember, every node, right, in the previous layer feeds to every node in the next layer. So this x1 here is going to feed to all the nodes in the next layer, right, and it will be scaled by a weight, and similarly the output, right, of this second feature is also going to feed into all the nodes in the next layer. So there are so many connections, right, and this is what introduces, right, or is able to model all the complex relationships that are there. And finally I will also connect the x4 to all the nodes in the next layer. So already you can see that just by having one hidden layer and 4 features, the crisscrossing of information looks pretty complex. Now in the output layer things are simpler here, because you just have all these 5 nodes from the hidden layer contributing to the output, and this y is basically your prediction for the target variable. Now at the end of the day, what is happening? You are able to write y as some function of the features, and in this case the features are x1, x2, x3 and x4, and this f here, right, this is the neural network. This f, which is a function approximator, right, is a neural network in our case. So I hope this gives you an idea of what happens inside a neural network, right. So the information flows through various layers, nodes, it is scaled, you add intercepts, and then finally you combine them in the output layer for the necessary output. Alright, so given this example, let us go ahead and further understand what happens in a neural network. Now the phrase neural network, right, so the term neural network, now that you have seen a simple neural network, it alludes to the similarity with the network of neurons that is there in our central nervous system. in the human body. Okay. So, thus neural networks in ML are artificial neural networks, because we are trying to mimic, right, what really happens in the human body in terms of there being neurons and them sending signals to each other, but of course this is in an artificial manner. So, therefore, these are called artificial neural networks, or ANNs for short. Okay. Now, there are various types of artificial neural networks depending on how the nodes are arranged and how information or data flows from one node to the next or one layer to the next. So, let us try to understand the various types of neural networks that are in use today. So, the topic at hand is types of neural networks. The simplest type of a neural network, and this corresponds to what we have drawn here in this particular example, is called a feed forward neural network. So, that is the first type of neural network that we will study. This is a feed forward neural network. Abbreviated as FFNN, and here data flows in one direction, the forward direction, from the input to the hidden to the output layer. These feed forward neural networks are used for simple or basic regression and classification problems. And for many of us, right, what we need from a neural network will basically be satisfied by these feed forward neural networks. This kind of an arrangement where information flows in one direction, right, this arrow represents the direction of movement of information or data, that is enough for us, and we do not necessarily care about a time series, or we are not performing more complex operations on the data in these layers. So, this is all enough for us, the feed forward neural networks. But in other cases, in some of the engineering disciplines or your particular problem at hand, it may be important to model a time series of data, right. So, right now we have talked about features, right, and these features, right, we are not really specifying, right, at what point in time or what point in space they are, but there could be for example, when you are modeling a time series, let us say you are modeling the load as a function of time, or the current as a function of time, the concentration of a pollutant as a function of time, then things start becoming important. What happens in the past will affect what is happening in the future. So, then it does not make sense to feed all the features, right, at once in the input layer. There must be a possibility to feed data later on into the network, right, and this is what leads to the concept of a recurrent neural network. So, the next type we will study, this is a recurrent neural network, or RNN, and as the name suggests, what happens here is that features are recurrently or repeatedly fed into the network, and it is very useful for modeling time series data or things like text. right, because what appears earlier in a paragraph of text will affect what happens later in that. Or if you are trying to write the structure of a molecule in a generative model, then again something like a recurrent neural network is very useful, because if you represent a molecule, right, as a structure, then as you add more and more atoms, the atoms that were added previously will affect what happens to the property of the molecule. So this is a recurrent neural network, and here data can flow through loops, right, such that the output from the previous step is fed as input to the next step along with a different set of features. Okay. So RNNs, as I mentioned, are useful for modeling sequential data. Right, including language and time series data. Now language models are very important. Of course, all models like LLMs like ChatGPT, Gemini, they are all based on neural networks, but not on recurrent neural networks. Recurrent neural networks were very popular several decades ago, but now they have been replaced in the previous decade by something known as transformers, and we will briefly learn what they do. But for language models, it is very important, right, what happens in the previous step should be fed as the input to the next step along with a different set of features, right. Now if you are trying to model a paragraph of text, right, these features are basically words. So every time you have to feed a new word, right, in order to predict the next word. So that is how a recurrent neural network is useful in language problems and natural language processing, but it can also be useful in time series data. As core engineers in various disciplines, you may want to factor in what happened previously in a system, how a signal in a system changes with time, or how the load that is being experienced by a system or the drag being experienced by an object can affect what happens in the future. If you want to include that, then it is important for us to be able to use recurrent neural networks to model time series of data. So this is certainly something that can prove to be useful. Now there are two types of RNNs, and we will touch upon them in this course. So two types of RNNs are particularly useful, and these are called, one of them is called a gated recurrent unit, or a GRU, and another one is called a long short term memory unit. As you can see here, we are starting to talk about things like memory, which comes into the picture when you have a time series of data, or when you have a paragraph of text, when you have to sort of decide how far back in the time series or how far back in the paragraph of text do I need to be, should I need to look in order to predict what is coming next. So intuitively you may be able to understand, right, what is happening here, but of course we will go into more details of GRUs and LSTMs a little bit later in one of the future lectures. So this is all about recurrent neural networks that we will discuss now, and we will come back to these later. The other type of neural networks, and this is particularly important for those involved in things like image processing and computer vision, these are convolutional neural networks. And these are abbreviated as CNNs, and here we use specific types of layers, right. So, these the data in this network, right, is processed via special types of layers known as convolutional pooling and dense layers. And the goal here is to extract high level features in the data. Right. So, CNNs find use, like I said, in processing images, because that is where there is a different set of regions in an image in which you can focus, right. So, these convolutional filters and the pooling filters or layers, they decide, right, which aspect of the image you are focusing on. Let us say you have an image of a cat or a dog or the image of a scenery, you have to make out various aspects within the scenery. It could be the animals in the foreground, the sky and the sun in the background, or the mountains. So, then each network or each layer may be trying to focus on different objects, right, in the image that you are trying to detect. So, CNNs, they find use in processing image data. In processing image and video data, right, using deep learning. So, this is about convolutional neural networks. The next type of neural network that I want to introduce, and this is particularly useful today, is the class of transformers, and these have become popular only in the recent decade, right, in the last 8 to 10 years. So, these use a so called attention mechanism instead of recurrence, which is used in RNNs to understand relationships in the input, right, and these find use extensively in modern large language models. LLMs in the field of natural language processing. Or NLP. So, examples basically are ChatGPT and BERT and so on. So, one type is generative pre-trained transformer. This is abbreviated as GPT, and this is the backbone of things like ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot and so on. Okay. So, this the GPT architecture falls within the class of transformers, and then the other example is called bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. BERT, and there are various other examples. Okay. The main idea here is that instead of recurrence, right, wherein you pass the data through a loop, right. So, instead of recurrence, which is what we discussed in recurrent neural networks RNNs, where data from the previous step was fed as input to the next step along with a different set of features. Here we use what is known as attention, so that we try to find the relationship between every word in a paragraph, for example with every other word, and this is done through there are various sort of variables known as query, key and value, and we will discuss a little bit about transformers in this course to the extent that is possible, given that this is an introductory course. So, we have learnt about 4 different types of neural networks in today's lecture. In the next lecture, what we will do is we will continue our journey into neural networks, wherein we will discuss a few other types of neural networks like autoencoders as well as generative adversarial networks GANs, which are used for generative purposes when you want to generate candidates or data, and from that we will segue into the working of a neural network, how the output is mathematically related to the input and how we can use that information to train neural networks for predicting various kinds of data. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.